Buenos dias. I'm very happy to be here. It's an honor. Thank you, Victor, for kind words. And Dean. So today I'm going to talk about a new area that I've been working on with my students. It's fairly new and not very well developed. So, but I thought I'll share these some of these ideas so that maybe some of you will be interested in aspects of it. So the rest of my talk, I'll try to explain what I mean by behavioral, like informatics and processing, and hopefully illustrate it with some examples from applications drawn from mainly health domain. So before that, I'll do a quick advertisement for USC and my lab. So my lab is interested in analyzing and interpreting, understanding signals of various sorts, particularly with a soft spot for human signals, basically to develop technologies to support and enhance human experiences. So kind of at a bridge between science and engineering and with a view toward applications. Specifically, we work on a number of different areas, from language processing, speech processing, emotions and machine learning and so on. Today, I'll talk about one specific research thread, what I call as behavioral signal processing, and I'll tell you a little bit what I mean by it. There are a number of application areas that our lab is working on, from defense and intelligence to actually health, education, and the arts. We work on music and so on. So one thing I was told by my colleagues is that to let you know in ITAM, there are fantastic undergraduates and masters, that you can go from undergraduate to PhD directly. You don't need to necessarily go get a master's, essentially. Okay, that's all for the advertisement part, my real talk. So my talk is going to be on human behavior. It's a very broad term. We know that human behavior is very complex, multifaceted. There's a connection between the mind, body, interplay that's reflected in behavior. It's also, shows the effect of the environment and other people that we interact with. So, when you think about human behaviors just from an engineering point of view, right? We see, well, it's expressed in a number of different ways, the way we act, the way we move, the way we emote. But also, people are interested in characterizing behaviors, depending on the domain. It's typical, atypical, disorder, anomalous, and so on. We're always interested in is this repeated behavior. For example, if you're online, people like Google and Facebook, they want to know what kind of behaviors, patterns you're doing, so they can provide you better experiences or sell you different things. So the question we're going to ask in this talk is, what is the role of engineering in the context of human behavior? Okay. So to do that, right, as engineers, we look at applications. So where are you going to use these ideas? So if you look at from everywhere, from user modeling, the example I gave you, an online case or customer care, to social science scholarship, like people study this. They've been studying this for centuries. And to education, learning, and training, a good teacher not just looks at whether a person is getting a right answer or wrong, but how they got there, right? Are they confused? Are they paying attention? How engaged are they? To actually number of problems in health and human health and well-being. So a lot of this is very human-based. Humans act as the sensors of behavior, interpreters, and also who respond or influence behavior. So we want to ask what role, if at all, computing and engineering ideas can play to support behavioral analysis and behavior interventions and so on. So to do that, let's sort of take this one perspective. There's lots of different perspectives. This perspective of informatics, basically data science perspective. We keep hearing about big data, machine learning, pattern recognition everywhere we turn around these days. So in this case, we can say, well, we are interested in human data of various kinds, communication, social interaction, physiology, both the expression of human data, also how we experience, because after all, and how we judge, because often we are constantly judging other people's behavioral cues to make the next move. So, and this purpose could be for different things, scientific understanding, technology development, build better game experiences, based on your behavior patterns, targeted application like clinical interventions, which is what I'll focus on. And the use context could be different, right? It could be in a laboratory to actually in the real world. And we often in engineering, we often try to trade off try to study things under constraints, human constraints, physical constraints, economic constraints, and so on. So let me show you some examples. If you can turn on the audio, it'll be good. The first example I will show is from customer care. You hear a telephone conversation, just the user. So here's the question we're asking, this behavior of, is there negative behavior developing? Okay. Oh, the audio is not working.
Peoria? No.
Let me play from the beginning.
Delayed bag? Yes. Peoria? Peoria? No. Peoria? P-I-A. No, can I talk to a person?
So you saw this call, right? The same person, and it started, and politely they're repeating itself, and the tone of the voice changed, the kinds of words he was using changed, and then you kind of, you're assessing in your mind by taking all these cues, right? Vocal cues, linguistic cues, interaction cues, your appraisal or belief of the state negative was increasing, right? So we can imagine building a machine that can do this, and people have been doing this now. So this is a game setting. Same kid is playing, different, same game. You want to know when the child is more confident than not, right? So let me play this video.
Yep. One is running, one is hiding behind a tree, one is saying boo.
Same kid.
It's hard to guess.
Right, so if someone asks you, right, if you're looking at the child, when this child is like more confident than not, you say, well, if you have this abstract construct like uncertainty, some internal state, you can say, well, your assessed perceived one, you use vocal cues, visual cues, the kid was frowning the face, looking away, and so on. And you can imagine mapping these into sort of, we can get signal processing, machine learning to build this, uncertainty assessment, algorithm, perhaps. So now I'm going to show you an example. This is from marital therapy. People, when you have problems in your marriage or relationship, you go to your psychologist, you sit and talk about it. So the psychologists are interested in things like, okay, affective dynamics, looking at constructs like blame. How much blame does each of the spouse place on others? Humor. These kinds of constructs, psychological constructs that are of interest for that domain. And they try to sort of, based on which they design, their recommendation or intervention planning. So the question you ask is like, can we build sort of algorithms that can help, measure these constructs automatically from data? So let's see this example. Look at the vocal, visual, body language, and everything. Audio, please.
Come home at a more reasonable time, rather than walking in the door at 11.
See, I just don't think you understand how much I have to do, like what my work entails.
Well, what is there to understand?
So, it goes like that, and this happens a lot. Right now, the state of the art is like they have, for research, behavioral coding, people sit and actually code these things. So we ask, what can computing help here? Okay, I'll tell you something. So the next example is from autism. Autism is a huge sort of a problem that we keep hearing about, in the news quite a bit because the prevalence ratings are going like skyrocketing. One in the U.S., 1 in 68 kids are diagnosed every year, and it's a neurogenetic disorder. But its characterization is basically social communication, behavior differences, repetitive behavior, and so on. So the constructs of interest are things like joint attention, shared enjoyment, atypical prosody, how your intonation pattern sounds, and so on. And based on which they kind of have ways to diagnose and also intervene and treat, and you want to measure. So again, we ask the question, can sort of data science help you here, provide tools for the experts to diagnose, stratify this child better and do individualized kind of treatment planning. So let me show you the example. So here the psychologist and the child are telling a story together, and look at the interaction.
To his medicine cabinet took some aspirin. Is that what he did when he saw the frogs?
So this child didn't pay attention to the psychologist. There was a laugh moment, right? Usually when you laugh together, there's joy and attention, shared enjoyment wasn't there. So these kinds of things, right now, the psychologist actually is a diagnostic setting. They keep pencil paper notes of what's going on. It's almost like a system identification problem in engineering. They do presses, provide stimuli, look at response, make a note. But imagine now what can computational ideas help here. The final example I'm going to show is virtual humans. Audio?
That happened that.
I'll start playing from the beginning.
What brings you into the office today?
Something bad happened that night.
I'm sorry to hear that. Can you tell me what happened?
I was in the car with Eddie and he stopped the car and wanted me to kiss him, but when I tried to stop him, he threatened me with a knife.
So we can also think about people are now actually developing virtual humans and robots to be an interacting partner. In this example, actually, at USC, we have an institute interested in simulation and training. They're building these kinds of virtual human patients who can provide different scenarios so they can train doctors to experience different clinical problems and settings, and you can measure behavior and use it as a training tool. So a lot of these possibilities exist. So in all these cases, right, the point I was going to make is that one thing from the data science perspective is that multimodal behavioral signals, right, provide a window into some of these higher level processes people are interested in. We are not just interested in what people are saying, but we're interested in things like, internal mental state or speaker state and so on. Some of these are accessible from overtly expressed and directly, expressed cues like, the vocal cues, facial expressions, body language. Some are, for the internal state, we don't have access directly. Maybe we have access to psychophysiological cues like heart rate or brain activity and so on. Maybe perhaps it provides you a part of the puzzle. So if each of these signals, right, provide a little window into this complex internal state, which is very dynamic human state that changes. But, but with these signals and, associated computing, one can imagine understanding how humans encode information and how we also process information that we get. Ideas progress towards mind-body relations, and also how people judge other people's behavior, because this is constantly happening as we move around, going about our lives, right? So this, I feel, is quantifying human behavior at this level is a very challenging engineering problem. It's not an easy problem. So behavioral signal processing, I sort of operationally have a definition saying that, it refers to computational methods that model human behavior signals manifested in these kinds of overt or covertly expressed cues, processed and used by humans explicitly or implicitly. So, and also one that actually facilitates human analysis and decision making, like helping a clinician make a better diagnosis or a teacher to make the appropriate scaffolding in a tutoring session, and so on. The outcome of this BSP, in a water form, we translate data into knowledge, is what I call as behavioral informatics. So it's both quantifying expressed behavior, but also sort of trying to quantify the human felt sense, how we judge. So we can ask, what is technology doing already? So lots of advances have been happening in computer science and engineering, everything from processing audio and video, speech recognition. Nowadays, every mobile device has, some capability. Computer vision is making a lot of progress, physiological signal processing, and so on. For example, from the speech signal, right, automatic speech recognition is basically the process of converting audio into words, right?
Is that right?
So let me go back and play it again.
So your chest pains have been going on just for 2 days, is that right?
So this is what speech recognition does, right? It transcribes what you speak, but you can ask what more can we do beyond inferring words? So current state of the art there in speech processing and spoken language processing, they try to ask all kinds of questions. They ask, who's the speaker? What's their age? What's the gender? Where are the prominent words? Not all words are equally important, right? Linguistically, some are more prominent, How do you phrase and prosodic chunking of the data? Just like we packetize information when we transmit over a network, humans do that actually very well. What is the speech act? What kind of communication are they trying to do? Are they asking a question? Are they making a statement? What's their affect? What's their attitude? These are all questions, like engineering questions people are asking now just from speech, but you can imagine extending this to visual signals and other signals. So today, but the point here in the behavioral informatics domain, beyond just these kinds of mapping, detecting and classifying, we want to shift the modeling into more abstract, domain-relevant human behavior constructs that will be meaningful for the domains, right? That is, it should be useful for the decision-making by the clinician, teacher, analyst, and so on. And that needs, new kind of modeling approaches that we need to think about, because it's not, these might be, sort of speech recognition could be an enabler, but it's not the end, right? The end would be, is the person blaming? How do you go from words and, vocal patterns to whether this person is blaming or not, right? That's the point we are trying to get. So a lot of things are happening currently in every domain, from sensing, doing ecologically valid behavior measurements, either in instrumented spaces or instrumented people, doing affective computing and social signal processing, how to model turn taking and cues like detecting smiles from video, laughter from audio, and so on. All these can be thought about as building blocks for behavioral informatics, right? So the important point I want to make before I sort of close this introduction is that these high-level descriptions decided by domain experts, right? Since the humans are sort of the end consumer of these kinds of computational methodologies, we can imagine a collaborative sort of learning between the human computation and the machine computation, something like that. If you think about today, behavioral coding, what happens, right? An expert, looks at data like a clinician, observes, makes judgments based on their prior models, and then they come up with sort of assessments. Now you can imagine inserting computing ideas here by trying to emulate what the humans do, their perception process, their processing process, to build signal processing, feature engineering, machine learning algorithms. Likewise, the machines can feed back what they're thinking and details. Now, for example, the machine can track fine changes in facial expressions or vocal expressions that are not probably, we may not pay attention to, or it's beyond our perceptual capability. So together we can try to see, well, how can we improve the behavioral informatics, the richness of how we understand an individual or behavior of people. Okay. So in summary, BSP, or behavioral signal processing, signal processing of human activity for analysis by collaborative human and machine computation. Okay. So the rest of the talk, what I'm going to do is to show some building blocks. I'll pay attention to sort of show the importance of data, because since I'm trying to sort of make a case for human data and data science approaches, with sort of using examples from affective computing. And then, if time permits, I'll go through some of these case studies and see how we can apply some of these ideas in these domains. And, okay. So multimodal data, that is data from multiple sources, is important for understanding behavior, because each of these data streams at best gives you a small slice insights into these complex internal hidden sort of latent behaviors. So the first thing I just want to mention, which I kind of referred to earlier, is that lots of things are happening in the signal acquisition domain. People are building very smart rooms, smart houses, and for the aging and so on, to sense the user identity, location, their activity in home, in classrooms, in laboratory, and so on. But also lots of things are happening in the instrumented people realm. Still, it's an ongoing effort. But we were talking earlier today, Fitbit. It's very common now. People are able to use feedback about at least the physical activity aspects of it. But there's much more people are trying to do with the revolution in wireless devices and sensing. So I'll show you some examples of these kinds of data. We'll start with the call center. I think Victor mentioned I used to work for AT&T. So the call center, you heard the example. So for example, there, how do you go about doing algorithmizing the emotion detection, right? The whole aspect of affective computing is now sort of become very popular. How do you estimate someone's emotional state from data? So from the speech, you can take vocal, we can do feature extraction, look at the intonation patterns, we can look at durations and spectral changes. We can look at the words by running a speech recognizer. You can manage the dialogue, see what kind of speech acts evolved, right? Are they repeating themselves? Or are they asking the same question again? By putting all these pieces together, we can actually have a running estimate of the frustration level or negative valence. For example, we showed early on that by putting together every piece of information, acoustic information, linguistic information, discourse information, we can improve our assessment of what we think their internal state is, here frustrated state. And the machine learning at the time was very simple, just support vector machine based, that worked pretty well. It's 10 years ago. The next example I'm going to show you is the affective computing community. If you look at literature in psychology, how do you represent sort of these emotional constructs itself as it's an open question in some ways. It could be categorical, like happy, sad type of things, or it could be more dimensional, like you can say how aroused or activated a person is, strength of their excitement, or how negative or positively valence a person is, or how dominant, the dominance and so on. So this work, what we did was to look at sort of more or less realistic data, talk shows, and one of my students was German.
Und hier ist eiskalt. Das ist mir scheißegal.
So data for building algorithms and machine learning, common databases and appropriately, for both algorithm development and validation is important. So these databases, by the way, are all available for, if people are interested in this kind of research. It's audio, video data, annotation, and so on. So here, particularly, we looked at, how to map this to these dimensional constructs of, imagining these states to be in some abstract space and trying to map these signal features onto this space. And we showed that we can do this pretty well from audio signal, but also visual signals and so on later on. But we know that emotions, these kinds of expressions are multimodal, so you can start building, saying, okay, now if you have access to facial expressions and movement of head and so on, do we encode useful information there? Yeah, the answer is yes. And so there's another database that we collected which had video but also motion capture of the face. So we could actually analyze in detail expressive facial expressions. Because computer vision, still it's a tough area for us to see how much important behavioral information is there in these data. That's why we did the motion capture, just to have a reference. Again, this data is available for those who are interested. So
You have a business here. What the hell is this?
The business? The business doesn't inspire me.
Oh, must you be inspired?
Yes. I like it for an hour a day.
So this kind of data, we had actors come to the lab, and we could collect a lot of these emotional data, and then, it could be useful for many things, like, we can do detailed sort of look at facial expressions. We can look at, how the effect of one person's emotions is on the other. We can do a lot of very interesting learning and modeling with that. One thing we did with this is to see how emotional information is encoded in the face and voice, and how can we sort of understand this encoding process. So once you have access to data, we can do a lot of machine learning with it, right? Something you're probably learning in your machine learning classes, right? If you have data, you can try to apply some of the theory that you're studying. So in this case, we showed early on again that vocally certain emotions are expressed pretty well, and we can use it for detecting. For example, if you look at this, what we did was take speech features, that derived from the audio signal, and we can try to see how well can you recognize whether they're angry or sad and so on. And we saw from the confusion between, for example, this is a confusion matrix, right? Between, for example, happiness and anger, and sadness and neutral are pretty high from vocal expressions, difficult to recognize them. But now if you look at the facial expression data, you see that it has complementary type of information. The confusion is for other things. So typically in these kinds of behavioral modeling, multimodal fusion is a very typical approach people take. But together in this table, we see that the overall performance, it just improves to over 90%. This kind of thing is done again and again. What is still not an open question is actually understanding how this information is encoded truly, when people are emoting, and it's very individual dependent, so people are still trying to work on this. But when you look at affective computing literature, we have access to audio and video. They try to put together feature fusion or decision fusion, all these things. We can also do more computationally sort of inspired representations of emotions. Now you can think about, so in general, real life emotions are not going to be just angry or just sad, or so it's a blend of things. So you can imagine sort of having a representation that's on a basis of these kinds of categorical sort of basis functions, and have a profile, emotion profile. And this is the work of one of my former students, Emily, who came up with this idea of profile-based emotion representations. Again, a very interesting machine learning sort of approach. The big problem in sort of affective computing has been, is how to generalize your algorithm. So you develop a fancy machine learning algorithm, works really well on a particular domain and data set. You try to apply the same thing on other things, it just doesn't work. And this kind of domain robustness is important. So this work, in recent work, we showed that going back to literature in psychology, what people have said about, how people encode arousal, and see if those actually provide us meaningful, valid sort of constructs for measuring arousal. And the results were very encouraging, very simple sort of vocal expressions of, intensity, pitch, and some spectral changes provide a nice tool. So this tool is available. With data, we can also do more with machine learning. Now we can imagine humans as two statistical systems that are coupled. You can think about this as a Bayesian net, coupled graphical model of your choice, couple of hidden Markov models or whatever, where you can condition the state of one on the state of the other, and vice versa, how you evolve over time. So for example, if I want to assess what my next state is going to be, emotional state, for example, so I can look at my dynamics, my history, right, which I from data, but I also can look at the history of the other person with whom I'm interacting, and together use that to drive my inference. Right? These things can be done, and that's what's happening in real life. So, and we've shown that we can do these kinds of modeling, turn-taking dynamics, and so on. Again, pretty well once you have good data. So extending, so we got voice, face, now we go to body. So there's another database, where again we used full body motion capture to generate the database, again available for free if people are interested in body language for synthesis or animation or recognition type experiments. So here we were particularly interested in the role of body language and how people encode sort of behavioral, useful behavioral information. Two, a trend in affective computing right now is to have continuous time assessment of behavioral changes. So we have annotated this data with perceived sort of activation or negative surveillance of these people. Like in this example I'm going to show you. So here.
I am too busy. Too busy. Too busy. I'm too busy.
So what you're seeing actually here is like two people, going and interacting, what were they doing? Here are the three curves are three people actually, like imagine a joystick. They are rating the perceived arousal level of these people in the scene, right? You can see that the trends are pretty good, but actual values of people don't, each of our perceived baselines are going to be different. And these kinds of, references provided by human assessment usually are used as sort of at least as a starting point for building machine learning algorithms. Now, if we want a machine, if it looks at this particular data, this vocal data, the body language, can you actually come up with a rating online of how well they are, what's their emotional state, right? So this is just a reference example. This database is available. So once you have such data, we can extract a lot of interesting features like body language features of, how I hold my body, my arms, my head, torso, relative to my interlocutor, my interactor. What's the distance proxemics is an important thing, right? When you're designing robots, human-robot interaction, you want to know how close should the robot be or how far away. All these are meaningful, And in one example, what we did was to take that and track the emotions continuously by combining, vocal information, body language information, and so on, by using Gaussian mixture modeling-based mapping. It's a pretty nicely established technique. But once you have these data, machine learning, can be done nicely, and once you understand the problem. Okay. So that was just to give you a very high-level view of, just with sort of interesting human data of vocal, facial expressions, body language, and so on, how we can ask very complicated questions with the help of computing ideas. Some of these things are not possible just by behavioral coding by people sitting and observing. So now what I'm going to do is switch gear and show some example case studies to see how some of these ideas can be applied. Okay. So the first is we studied so from Los Angeles, like Hollywood, right? We have lots of actors. So we wanted to study improv. There's always been in artificial intelligence (AI), computers that can improvise, or agents that can improvise. Imagine that if you're building a robot or a virtual human, that when provided with a new situation, how will they act? What decisions will they make, and how will they actually communicate that? So that was the idea of that project. So there are lots of different questions, but one of the questions we wanted to ask is like, okay, can I predict the body language of my interlocutor by looking at the speech and body language of the other interactant? Okay, so from this person's speech and body language, can I predict what move this person is going to make? Right? For example, you can imagine a situation, a robot or a virtual human, like in the example I showed, is looking at the user, okay? By looking at the speech and body language, it will know automatically what body language posture it should assume based on this, not independently based on what the designer thought it should be. Okay, are you with me? Yeah. So in particular, we also wanted to examine things like states. And we looked at two different states, starting this interaction in a friendly way or in a conflictive way. You go into this with a friendly attitude or not, right? So we wanted to know how these kinds of predictability will work out or not in this example. So we used that data I just showed you, extracted a lot of audio features, pitch and energy, body language features, arm movement, angle, velocities, proxemics, and so on. Right? For example, cosine of face is like the angle of, between how they're looking at each other or away. That's a feature, right? And that's important for approach avoidance. Remember, when you're approaching, you're looking and leaning. If you're avoiding, you're turning everything away, and so on. We can computerize. So the way we set up the problem is to say, well, okay, here's the interlocutor and the target. I can look at a window of observations. Body language, speech features, and I can use that, and do my clever feature engineering. Here we did, took these features, did some dimensionality reduction using, PCA, principal component analysis, used that in a variety of different sort of machine learning sort of approaches, both discriminative and, in fact, a nice method that leverages both generative and discriminative approaches using Fisher kernels. To predict the target person's body language. Once you kind of know the problem, we can come up with nice algorithms. So first of all, we wanted to show, hey, whether there will be useful information from my speech and language about what you're going to do, what your body language is going to be. And the answer was yes, there's some information there correlationally. And in fact, we can show that depending on the nature of interaction, if it's conflictive, we see a lot of, avoidance behaviors, what psychologists know pretty well. Qualitatively, at least they've explained this, but we can actually compute this, in terms of velocities differences, orientation differences. In the friendly interaction, you can see a lot of, hands were very useful, at least in this population, on the stance. So once we had that, we built, machine learning algorithms, based on, support vector regression and, Fisher kernel mapping, and showed that in fact, we can predict the velocity of arms and body, with these kinds of speech and body language features very well when the interactions were friendly, but when the conflictive interaction, basically there's divergence in these kinds of joint coupling between these two systems, right, two humans, and the predictability was different. In fact, this kind of things, we've seen that, there's a concept of, those who studied behavior sciences or so on, this notion of synchrony or entrainment. When two systems are sort of operating, or they, biological systems, they tend to synchronize in many ways. And this synchrony sort of, is particularly seen in humans when there's more positive affect. We've seen that. I'll show you again in the vocal domain. So when you're hanging out with your friends you haven't seen, right, you start sounding alike quite a bit, using the same words, the prosody is same. And that's an important sort of aspect of human, and we can actually try to model this as dynamical systems. So when there's friendly stance, looks like there's higher predictability. And in fact, we've shown that we can discover some of these patterns automatically by machine learning by using primitives and based approach, a view. And we've, in very recent work, we've shown that we can, since hand movements were very useful, we can actually discover this from data as primitives, and in fact use that in turn to predict what kind of attitude that you have. Are you, in a friendly stance or not? Or what kind of, congruence in this interaction there is. Is it a friendly interaction or a friendly conflictive interaction, and so on. So kind of, you can see the possibilities that computing offers once you kind of know how to go about doing this, sort of building upon, empirical evidence and theoretical aspects of what's been developed in fields. So now, I showed you the video of these couples interacting, right? Let me show you some results from there, it's still ongoing work. Okay, here, typically what people do, psychologists and experts in marital research, they actually collect data, they do experiments based on different therapeutic approaches. They have coding manuals that kind of codify the kinds of behavioral constructs that are relevant for their design and for their theory. And then they try to have, usually undergraduate students, code these data, and they try to make decisions based on that. Now what we're saying is how we can automate some of these processes. So the very simple-minded thing we first know, so the data we worked on, in all these cases, right, I showed you examples from the lab. Now for these actual domains, we actually work with real-life data. In this, we collaborated with our colleagues at UCLA. We had lots of audio-video data, 100 hours of data from couples actually going through therapy, and that's our starting point. We also have data, what the experts thought about these, they didn't imagine computer scientists, working in these areas when they did this work. So they had things like, level of acceptance, level of blame, how much positive affect was there, humor, how much humor did, on a scale of 1 to 9, how much humor did in this 20-minute period did the husband display? So these are like high-level constructs, right? And so they have these descriptions, and they derive this sort of manually. So the very simple question computer scientists and machine learning people ask, oh, okay, I have data, I have some representations, can I learn these from data, right? Just like the humans did, very simple idea. That's exactly what we did, right? First, we said, well, okay, we have these multimodal signals, right? We have vocal signals, we can calculate voice activity, pitch and energy. We have words, we can run a speech recognizer, we can get, words, topic models, and, word fragments, we can run computer vision algorithms, head orientation, body orientation, all that stuff. So the very first simple question we asked was, okay, here are all these behavior, blame behavior, positive behavior, and so on. Like in the list I have, acceptance, sadness, right? These are abstract sort of things. Can I separate these extremes from data directly by learning, by doing machine learning? So in fact, the very first thing was we said, well, I'll just run the audio through these audio signal processing. We know a lot of audio signal processing. Take the very simple machine learner, like a linear SPM, a support vector machine. How well can I just from audio predict these codes, the behavioral codes that the humans got, right? And the results were very encouraging. Our colleagues got really excited because, we can do, depending on the particular construct, very well. In some of them, over 80-85% just from audio. We don't even know what they're talking about, what they're doing, and so on. And this got really, got us very excited, And we said, well, now if I add, we know language is very important, when people are talking, that encodes a lot of information about behavior. Can I run natural language processing algorithms and mapping sort of behaviorally salient models that we can build for each of these things? Can I do better? Sure, people have written a lot of papers in psychology, if you think about, the use of pronouns, for example, it's me, it's not you, and because use of first person versus second person pronoun actually encodes blame and so on very well. But if you run machine learning algorithms, it automatically pulls out all these things for you. So by combining sort of acoustic and language, again, fusion, right, idea, does, helps us. We can think about building upon this very simple-minded thing. What did we do on this? In psychology behavioral coding manual, what we just showed so on is it's like a very direct, simple-minded application of behavioral coding by automating it with access to data. But I think computing offers more than just that, right? Here are some challenges. First of all, we can capture context and combine multiple sources of information, even those that are not accessible to human perception, or for example, we can look at data across space and time, and combine them in very interesting ways. We can actually look for, not all portions of the data actually are meaningful for dictating your overall judgment of a particular construct. It depends, right? You may have heard about it, the thin slice theory, right? So people, psychologists have shown that, for certain kind of behavioral sort of assessment, you don't need much data. Just when you walk into a room, people know what impression they have on you for giving you a job or something like that thin slice theory. But it depends on the construct, right? How do you build impression about whether this person is more negative or not? Do you wait for accumulating data, or you just need one or two examples? But these kinds of questions, you can actually make it more computational by asking it as a salient instance learning problem, right? You can, multiple instance learning, you might have heard that in machine learning. You can post this as that. Or you can go from neuroscience inspired, bottom-up procedures like, okay, defining attentional models, salience models, in computer vision and audio. People are working on algorithms that are inspired by neuroscience. So can imagine building models around these kinds of salience and perceptual processing. When people rate behaviors, sometimes it's not done cardinally, or 2 is greater than 1, 3 is greater than 2 and 1. How do you build ordinal regression kind of approaches? Models for entrainment. Can I really model the interaction between two coupled systems? In ways, and look at synchrony between them. How similar are they, or diverging or converging? Biological systems. When you and I, we are looking at the same audio, right? Piece of music, we might sort of respond to different portions differently. We might like different portions differently. Likewise, when we judge, right, data, even experts are reliable, or they have preferences for different portions of data. So how do I bring these kinds of ideas into machine learning? It's a lot of open questions for computing. So in the multimodal domain, we worked on this in this couples data. Our students been working on things like, tracking head motion, tracking, join synchrony between that. We showed that head motion carries important information for behavioral analysis. And we can model it with motion tracking automatically from video, right? When we do video coding, there's a motion estimation. We can apply something similar to model rigid head motion, and then map the head motion to behavioral constructs. We can also, if we have access to collecting better video data, in our lab we had rigged it up with cameras and so on. We can actually collect data in real time. In fact, we have a psychology clinic right now where couples come for therapy with lots of cameras. And so we can get data real time. The green person is active talker, you can separate data. We can get a lot of information if you have access to control of the data collection. And with that we can model approach avoidance and kinds of behaviors pretty well. Right? We showed that. I would just say a few words about this instance learning idea. So basically, in instance learning, we are interested in portions of data that describe a particular construct. For example, in our case, in this couples therapy case, you can ask, are there specific turns over a 20-minute interaction that are salient given a particular session level behavior you're interested in, blame? So can you pick out those portions of the interaction which led you to believe that there is high blame or low blame, right? Or humor or lack of humor, because these are not like something that's present throughout an interaction, right? Can you build an algorithm to do that? So the way we did this, extract features, right? Because those are cues that tell you about it. And basically the idea is to apply a particular kind of, at least we apply a particular kind of multiple instance learning called, based on maximizing diverse density. The idea works this way. So say you have positive examples of these classes, high blame, low blame. What you do is you choose classes close to the positive instances and away from the negative instances to define the salient prototype. Once you have these, basically they help maximize the, diverse density. Once you have that, then you can use any instance that comes with respect to the salient. It's almost like quantization problem, and use that to do your classification. And if the classification is as good or better than using all the data, then we can deem that these data-derived instances to be meaningful. It's almost like a feature extraction type thing, but instance level, example level. And this was encouraging. We've done this with audio, text, and with the visual features. That's encouraging. Again, the point here I wanted to make is, like, without going into much detail, is that these kinds of behavioral problems open up interesting questions for computing, how we can do data selection, data modeling, and so on, which are above and beyond what humans can do. If you give a big session, right, it's very hard for people to pick out like the sessions that bear this kind of, from an information theoretic point of view, bears this kind of information entropy measure or so on. So the next idea along that line of interesting computing problem is this notion of modeling interaction synchrony or entrainment. So in psychology and biology, people have been talking about this notion of systems trying to synchronize or diverge quite a bit, depending on the internal state and so on. It has implications for the overall behavior. So in our context of human interaction, we can ask questions like, okay, how do people sound alike as they interact in a conversation? When do they sound alike and not? Right? So let's see how we can operationalize this idea, right? You can take features from people speaking, right, using signal processing. What we did was calculating similarity between when humans interact is not that easy because it's asynchronous, because I take a turn, you take a turn, sometimes we overlap, but usually these turns are different lengths, and it's very hard to compute similarity between signals. So instead what we did was project these features onto a space and embed them in a space and look at similarity mathematically, divergence between elements in that space. And that's what we followed. Now the question is this mathematical measure a good proxy for synchrony? How do you validate it? The answer is, difficult, right? The way people go about doing it is, if you imagine a construct like synchrony is important for a positive interaction more than a negative interaction, the mathematical measures you come up with can also do the same thing in a cross-validated way. Maybe that's a good proxy, right? It provides you an automatic way of doing this. Then you can run this on like terabytes of data. Then, what humans can, this is something humans can't do, how to sit and mark, were they in training or not in training, right? So we have done this with like, both, vocal and visual and even physiological signals I'll show you in a bit. Finally, this problem is an interesting problem. How do you bring multiple people's perspective into the machine learning algorithm in the pattern recognition? One idea, we said that people are pretty consistent about how they respond to data. When you or I process particular data, they're pretty consistent how we process data, and we can bring this into the signal processing, sort of the machine learning algorithms pretty well. So in a recent paper that we kind of showed this, sort of even though there's big global variance, we can have local constraints we can put on how we map data, do pattern recognition. And this so-called GVLC model that we had. And we showed that, we can do more robust estimation of behavior, like, emotions and higher order behavior, and other machine learning questions. Okay. So my final example I want to share, now I have lots of examples and I can go on and on, about different domains. The final example that I want to share is in autism, which I mentioned again. So I said that this is a very enormous sort of health condition, a lot of economic impact and also a lot of emotional impact on society. And it's characterized by, even though it's neurogenetic, it's characterized by difficulties in social communication, it's characterized by repetitive behavior and so on. So you can ask, what can technology do here, right? So a couple of things, I think. One is use computational techniques to better understand this condition. It's very heterogeneous. One of the things people talk about autism is every individual is different. So behavior stratification is still sort of elusive. People don't know. If you want to design a particular treatment, we have to do it at the level of individual. So we can imagine using sort of computational techniques to better understand an individual. We can also track and quantify progress in response to intervention. Right now, if you look at the statistics of 1 in 68 to the number of trained clinicians and so on, and also many of these happen outside the clinic behaviors, you can imagine creating computational methodologies to track and quantify these progress also over time and personalize treatment. As and when the child is going to develop, going to improve with respect to hopefully treatment. We can also use sort of interfaces and systems like spoken dialogue systems or for targeting specific as tools for targeting interventions. A lot of these possibilities exist. So for example, in this video, we can play. So we have
Tongue, to be a line maker, to be a regular line maker.
Yeah, good job.
So joint storytelling is something that people use a lot to actually understand both the cognitive and affective aspects of interaction. Here, it just illustrates, we can study a lot of things like joint attention, turn taking, the kinds of constructs people who are studying, behavioral scientists interested in autism are interested in. We can also study things beyond observational things, like you can look at the emotional arousal from physiological signals. This is a signal to see when two people are synchronizing or not synchronizing, when people are scaffolding. A lot of things that are possible with signal processing. And you can also understand how expression, perception of social cues in autism can be done. So one of the big things there is, even though they may smile, people with autism, it's often perceived as awkward or something off, right? So in one project that's ongoing, we're interested in what makes it awkward, this perception. So again, computational ideas can come in handy. So I'll show you a couple of examples, one in autism assessment. Basically, these are the dimensions along which people try to characterize an individual. So one particular dimension is prosodic, sort of the musicality in one's speech. It's considered to be atypical. It's a marker, but it's a very impressionistic marker. So one of the things we try to do is can we quantify this? Just an example, right? We know speech processing and language processing. We say, well, okay, I'll try to convert the qualitative descriptions what psychologists have in their manual to quantitative sort of constructs like pitch and intensity and duration and vocal quality behavior, and then we can sort of map and show how the prosodic aspects of the child varies with the perceived severity of the condition, autism condition. But what we found also, that was consistent with what psychologists have said, but we did the same analysis on the psychologist who is interacting with the child. We found that, in fact, the same kind of feature behavior was happening even in the psychologists. They are actually attuning the behavior to the child's behavior, both in a conscious response, but also the human response. In fact, we showed that by just using the psychologist's vocal patterns, we can predict the severity of the child's diagnosis. Did you get that point? Instead of looking at the child's behavior to predict the child's diagnosis, we can look at the interacting psychologist's behavior because they are reflecting and changing the behavior. So this is very exciting. The main point here being that when you're studying humans, you have to study this as a whole. You have to model interaction dynamics, and so on. In fact, we can apply, we can do this more computationally sophisticated way to study the synchrony in affect. And in fact, we can study the synchrony in physiology. We've shown that actually when parents and child interact, doing a task together, when the parent and child sort of align with each other, when they're trying to scaffold and help each other, and in fact, that was very important in therapy. Because one of the things in psychotherapy or behavioral therapies is that we still don't know, we know that the therapist-patient fit is important. We don't know, that's an elusive concept. We don't know how to objectify when a particular move by a therapist is successful. Are there markers of that? So by looking at objective data, behavioral, observational data, but also psychophysiological data, we can start to sort of unfold some of these things better with what moves are good, how can we individualize. So in recent work, we showed that in emotional regulation in children with autism. So finally, we can also use computer characters as sort of as a proxy or an agent to participate in some of these interactions, like storytelling paradigm or teaching particular pro-social behavior and so on. So that's again, building dialogue systems type things. So lots of possibilities. Okay, we showed that, for example, can we understand when and how the laughter of children with autism different, or when it happens, and can we predict when it's going to happen based on the context and so on. So a lot of very interesting questions can be asked. So what I gave you was like a whole whirlwind tour of many possibilities, starting with sort of defining the possibilities with computing and engineering, the study of human behavior, showing some building blocks of affective computing, but also how to sort of turn this and actually contextualize in specific domains. So one thing is clear, right? These kinds of behavioral constructs and the descriptions depend on what the end user decision making and whether it could be autonomous or many times machine-based or human-based decision making. Those descriptions, how can they be derived from data? So the data scientific sort of approach, and this I believe is can be done most effectively by a collaboration between human intelligence and machine intelligence together. So a lot of open challenges, from robust capture to actually scientifically meaningful representation to actually questions about ethics, data provenance, security, because if you're talking about human data, clinical data, I think this is not a nice sort of thing to do, but an essential thing to do is to have very productive collaborative partnerships with all these experts, computer scientists, cognitive scientists, psychologists, and clinicians and so on. So in conclusion, I think human behavior, as we started, is a very complex construct. Can be described from a variety of perspectives. We took a sort of a computing science engineering view. Both challenges and opportunities in every aspect, from sensing to processing to modeling. But I think what is more exciting is the technological and societal possibilities. If we were to scale up even a small aspect of diagnosis or treatment, right? Imagine the impact it can have on society. And so, in sum, I think behavioral signal processing, helps us do things, experts know how to do, but provide, more efficiency, economy, scale. But the even more exciting part is being able to handle new data, sort of new models, creating tools for discovery, basically, things that we haven't imagined yet. So I'll stop there, and I thank all my colleagues here, and thank you for listening to me. I'll take questions.